So welcome to the show. My name is Muhammad Kalaji. I'm an AWS community builder and software engineer at Zero and One. Today I'm with Dan Moore. Dan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. My name is Dan Moore, and I am head of DevRel at FusionAuth. We're an authentication and authorization provider.
You're the head of developer relations at FusionAuth. Would you like to talk more about FusionAuth, what the company is trying to solve, and what does it offer?
Sure. Real briefly, we are in the same space as Auth0 or Keycloak or Cognito. We provide the ability for developers to bring FusionAuth into their application, and in turn, FusionAuth takes user management, authentication, and authorization off your plate. So common user workflows like registration or forgot password are handled by FusionAuth. And we're a little bit different than some of our competitors in that you can pay us to run FusionAuth for you, or you can download it and run it yourself. And we have paid editions and free editions. So you could, and we have people doing this, download FusionAuth, run it yourself, have hundreds of thousands of users for free.
So it's more like so it's open source at a certain point, or it's just a free software on the community version?
It's free as in beer, as they say. So it's not open source. You can't look at the source code, but it is free to use.
Okay, that's quite interesting. As a head of developer relations, correct me if I'm wrong here, but your role runs setting up strategies and programs to recruit, inspire, and enable developers and partners to solve complex problems regarding around FusionAuth. What's the difference between your role and a similar role, let's say like a developer advocate?
Sure. So I think developer relations is a relatively young field. I know there are people doing things like DevRel in the 2000s, but really it kind of came into its own in the 2010s. And so DevRel itself spans a lot of things. It spans what I would consider to be developer advocacy, which is what you think of and what you mentioned, where you're going out and you're speaking at conferences, you're trying to educate developers about your particular tool and whether it's a fit for their needs or not, and you're evangelizing it, right? And technical evangelism is another name I've heard for that. Then there's developer experience engineers who are focused on SDKs and documentation and making sure that the developer can get what they need without actually talking to the developer necessarily. Maybe they'll talk to them briefly, but really they're not out on the conference circuit. And then there's community builders who are people frankly, like you, who are talking to devs and building community, helping devs support each other and support themselves. And developer relations, in my mind, spans those three things, right? So there's promoting the product, there's helping developers make best use of the product, and then there's helping developers help each other. And those are three kind of different hats that you can wear. And luckily right now, I'm in a company that is young enough in its growth stage that I get to wear some of all three of those hats. And then to your point, also speak to the CEO and the CTOs about strategy and bring feedback back from developers, or even just represent my own experience and say, actually, this thing's busted and we need to fix that. And I did that recently. We released a big feature called Skim, and I was the first user of it, right? Not necessarily. I mean, someone could have used it that I don't know about, but I built out an initial implementation that used that particular feature, and in the process discovered a couple of bugs that really I was ahead of our users in discovering, because they would have discovered them eventually if they'd done the same implementation process.
That's quite interesting. So, for example, you go to literal events, so you talk with people, or you talk with partners. Let's say you go to a partner, you do like a sales pitch of the product. This is how you use it. We enable your developers to use FusionAuth in your application, and this is how the implementation to do.
Yeah, more tip. We've been talking about building a partner program. We have a few, but typically the partner stuff is more like co-marketing. So it's not necessarily me teaching them how to use FusionAuth. It's more like I did a webinar a little while ago where I got on the phone with a partner and we basically talked about how they use FusionAuth to solve their customers' problems. What are some future upcoming features of FusionAuth, that kind of thing. I'm because we're a developer focused tool. We do a lot of just direct communication developers, and that, as you mentioned, is typically through conferences, although meetup groups, talks at meetup groups, and then also just kind of interacting on forums or in Slacks or sometimes on Stack Overflow. Basically try to meet, or on Twitter, right? Try to meet developers where they are. And one thing I love about developer relations that's kind of different than marketing, because I think they're definitely adjacent, but like in developer relations, and I've said this before, basically you can say, no, we're not the right tool, right? You have the conversation with the developer, you learn their requirements, and sometimes Cognito is the right tool. Sometimes FusionAuth is, sometimes Auth0 is. And my goal is to educate the developer and help them make the right choice. And then obviously in the course of that, sometimes they pick FusionAuth. Sometimes I learn something that FusionAuth needs to actually implement or could be better at in order to make us a more compelling alternative.
So before you became a developer relations at FusionAuth, you were also a solution architect. Do you want to talk about what's the role of a solution architect in your perspective, and what's the requirement for someone who is a solution architect, what they're supposed to do in a company?
Sure. So actually, I was a head of DevRel at FusionAuth before I was solution architect at FusionAuth, and I saw an opportunity to take on that role, the solution architecture role, and I'm part-time solution architect. I'm not full-time there, but in my mind, solution architects are post-sales. So in some companies, they're pre-sales for sure. And in case your listeners aren't familiar with the term, basically, when you're selling kind of a complicated product like FusionAuth, a lot of developer tools, sometimes people will just go and click it and buy, and then they'll be off and running. But sometimes you need a more consultative approach. So that means you're talking to somebody, you're helping them figure out if the tool is right for them over an extended period of time. It could be weeks, it could be months. And, you're obviously not talking to them every day for a month or two, but you might be exchanging emails. They might be asking questions. Hey, how do I do this? How do I make FusionAuth do that? Anyway, that's all pre-sales. And then at some point they sign on the dotted line. They sign a contract, they pay you money. And then, but even though they've kicked the tires in that pre-sales period, they may not have fully implemented it, right? And so post-sales is the support that happens afterwards. And obviously there's customer support folks, and we have a number of those at FusionAuth, but the solution architecture is kind of that second or third layer of help. So lots of times I'll get on the phone or on a video call with a customer, and they'll say, hey, we're trying to do this thing. And it'll be like, we have users who we need to find out, which company they're associated with before we let them log in, or we want to support users in different regions of the world. What's the best way to do that? And so it's architectural problems, high-level integration issues, rather than, hey, how do I change the logo on the theme, which is something that we push to documentation, but also customer support will help with, that kind of different stuff. So I think the big thing about being a solution architect is, again, you have to be consultative, and I have a background in consulting. That means that you need to really put on your listening ears and really have a good, try to figure out what the customer knows and what they don't know by listening very closely when they describe their problem, because they understand their problem better than you do. I understand the solution better than they do, which is why I'm on the call. And we're trying to kind of meet in the middle there. But sometimes customers don't know what they don't know, which is why they're, engaging with us and buying support from us and want that help. And your job as a solution architect is to help them, basically help them figure out the best way to use the tool to solve their problems. And again, they know their problems, and sometimes their problems are technical, but very often, sometimes the problems are social or, organizational. And obviously I can't wave a magic wand and help with all those, but you can definitely say, given your constraints, here's how I would approach this with the tool that we have.
Usually when I knew about solution architect is the pre-sale version. So I'll give you like an example of someone like an AWS solution architect, whether associate or pro. They would come up and let's say someone would pitch in the solution of a problem, and you need to advise which AWS service to utilize for that solution. But mostly the time, the solution architect after the post-sales are usually like you have a finished solution, how to cut costs, for example, on the existing solution. That's my idea of what a solution architect is on the pre-sale and the post-sale.
Interesting. So on the post-sale side, the solution architect is coming in and is much more focused on optimization or, as you said, cutting costs.
Yeah.
Is it the same people that go on the pre-sales and the post-sales calls, or they're like kind of separate folks?
Sometimes they're the same person. Sometimes they're two different people.
Yeah.
So you might meet with someone who's the pre-sale, can help you with the optimization on the post-sale. Sometimes you might handle someone who takes post-sales much more than pre-sales.
Yeah. Well, AWS, for one, is a much bigger organization than FusionAuth. And then I think that this actually points to an interesting thing, which ties back to the DevRel conversation, is titles are so slippery, right? And this is something, again, for your listeners to know, like a solution architect at FusionAuth is going to be different and have different sets of responsibilities than a solution architect at AWS. And not just because of the size, it's because the organization has chosen to take this title and mean different things with it. I have gotten called in on some pre-sales calls when we have sales engineers as well, and when they want a different perspective to come in. But yeah, I'm mostly post-sales in my solution architecture role at FusionAuth.
I'm going to move to the next question, which is like, you're someone who works in the authentication and authorization field, but just in FusionAuth. Why would I want to resolve towards using a solution like FusionAuth for authenticating and authorizing my services compared to creating something in-house?
Sure.
I understand there's a security aspect and patching things up as like a top priority. Sometimes you might slip on it when you don't do it. But how would you convince someone to use, let's say, FusionAuth for authenticating their services? How would you convince a company to adopt this? I ran into something. I'll give you like a personal experience of myself. There's a developer group based in the MENA region, which is called MENA Dev. I asked the question, most of them are my friends, so we know each other. So I asked them like, I want to create an open source solution and I want to use authentication. The problem is do I have to implement authentication on my own, or would I want to use a service? The problem is when you utilize, let's say, Cognito, you can become locked into Cognito. Someone might say, hey, I don't want to use Cognito. Maybe I want to use Keycloak as an example. Or maybe if I want to use FusionAuth. One of them came up and pitched, like, you write an adapter for the authentication, like a standard class, and you start to slot in providers, and you say like, hey, if you want this provider, you just support it, and you add it to this layer that handles all of the software exactly the same. But I told them, like, if I created my own solution, should I like isolate it differently, or should it be part of the container? Let's say if I created a container project, that means whenever I ship, there's going to be my authentication in every single container. Does this have kind of complexity? All these kind of questions come into mind.
Yeah, we could spend an entire hour talking about this, and I have in some ways, because it really is kind of the key question, right? And so I think that the answer is, kind of the quick and dirty answer is, would you use a database? And lots of cases, an external database is the better solution for you because it takes care of storing data. It takes care of optimizing queries. Other people are working on it, making better all the time. But there are cases where you would say, actually, no, I'm gonna write my own data storage format. I'm gonna write it to disk, and that's the right thing for me to do. I think auth is very similar. And so if your listeners take nothing else away from this podcast, I hope they say, don't write your own auth. Like, there's basically three big categories of auth, as far as I can tell. One is you roll your own, and that means that you have total control. You're hashing your own passwords. You're picking your algorithms. You're building all those flows. Two is you use a library, and that could be a library that's embedded in a framework. Could be something like Devise for Ruby on Rails, or I know the Microsoft stack has some stuff built in. I think it's called Identity Model. And, Django has one. Like, every framework has one. There are also ones that are kind of snap in, like Passport.js, I believe, is another one.
I've used that, by the way.
Yeah, and I think that's a fine solution. And so the issue there is when you kind of leaned into, right, you kind of nodded to, is when you have that library, it works fine when you have one application. And that's great because a lot of people only have one application. But in this world of SaaS and building businesses, you sometimes add more applications. And then suddenly now you have these silos of user data. And that's where consolidating them into an auth server like FusionAuth or Cognito or Auth0 starts to make more sense. Now, address your lock-in question. There are obviously some bits of lock-in, but the nice thing about authentication, at least, is that there's a fair number of standards out there. So SAML is one standard. It's kind of old. OIDC is another standard, and that's the one I would recommend your folks look at. And with that standard, and we actually have people doing this with FusionAuth, they say we're going to stick just to OIDC for authentication, and that way we can swap out FusionAuth for something else if FusionAuth causes issues for us in the future. Now, that limits you because the standard doesn't necessarily do everything you want it to do. And I will say that moving between different OIDC providers, there's probably going to be subtle differences, but I'll guarantee you that you'll have much better ability to transition between two different OIDC providers than you would from an OIDC provider to something that was homegrown or vice versa. The last thing I'd say about migration and lock-in is I built about 5 different migration guides for, moving from Cognito to FusionAuth and moving from Auth0 to FusionAuth and we have one for Firebase. And so I've written a number of these solutions, and I'll tell you that it's going to be a big project for sure. But to me, I think that starting out, again, using a library is perfectly fine. Using an auth server is perfectly fine. They kind of serve different needs, but the migration between different auth providers is still going to be. It's going to be a big impact. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's definitely possible to do. And the win of having somebody else build all these workflows for you and take care of that security aspect, which you mentioned at the beginning, the risk of a data breach is, the downside of data breach is pretty catastrophic. If someone basically can get into your system and read all your passwords and all your users' credentials are compromised. So that's what people are weighing against. And I don't want to end with that kind of fearsome thing, because there are other benefits in terms of accelerating your development cycle and basically taking something that's undifferentiated off your plate. But those are kind of the things that I think about when I suggest someone using something like FusionAuth.
There's also the cost optimization as well. So let's say if you use Cognito or Firebase, you don't pay for hosting, let's say, a server for the authentication. So you get this kind of like a nice perk, but then you enter with a lock-in from the provider. So let's say, for an example, Cognito has like a set amount of users, like a soft limit that you have to raise limits. For example, Firebase might screw you up with the pricing later on as the number of users get. We know the whole idea of Firebase increasing in price when the amount of users use the platform, rather than using, let's say, a set amount, let's say a milestone, and you pay for those or you pay per user. They increase it a little bit much more.
Right.
But there's the good part about, let's say, hosting the authentication or using a service. So if I want to use Cognito, I don't have to worry about deploying an auth server because it's already deployed for me. Yep. But what happens is that I have to pay for other stuff that also fills the gap of the authentication. Yep. But when I host my own server, I have to also worry about optimizing the server to fit the loads, which is also another complexity on its own.
Yep. I mean, nothing's free, right? Like, you're going to pay one way or another because we all like to eat, is what I like to say. And I think that it's on every developer who's listening to this podcast to determine what the right set of trade-offs are. Because if you write it yourself, the third option is you write it yourself, and then you're responsible for maintaining it and, again, taking care of features and functionality and security issues. Now, if you write yourself, you're never going to pay an MAU fee like you would with Cognito, but you will absolutely pay in terms of time or hiring another developer to maintain something for you. So it's a question of finding out what works best for you. And we have found that a lot of people want to run FusionAuth themselves for that level of control, right? They own the database, they own the security perimeter around FusionAuth because they're running it in their own servers. And those tend to be bigger companies, to be honest, with like a DevOps team or something like that, often running on AWS. And then we have other people who say, well, actually, I want to just pay you to run this for me. And, you know, I'm okay with paying that monthly fee because I want that off my plate. Or actually, in some cases, people say, actually, I don't just want that off my plate. My security team wants it off our plate too, because it's users' personally identifiable information called PII, and we don't even want to touch it. We don't want anything to do with it. We want you to own all that liability and all that risk. You know, FusionAuth lets you move between those things, but it's definitely a choice. And to get back to your original question about, you know, the meetup group, that, you know, what's the right solution? There is no 100% right solution. The question is, what trade-offs are you willing to accept?
Yeah, it's a tough kind of trade-off, because especially when you're starting your own solution, because you start to visualize a lot of things and you won't reach to a position till you actually be like, okay, that's it. I'm just going to use something that's out there. I'm going to go with it.
I would say, don't write your own solution. If you want to kind of host it yourself and have that level of control, find an open source library and build on top of that, because authentication seems like it's this easy thing to start out with. And I have built an authentication system myself many years ago, and it was horrible at the end because you end up having to either have functionality that is missing that your users expect, or you end up having like rebuild all this stuff. So again, if it's only one thing that people take away from this, it's don't build your own. Look at libraries, look at auth servers out there, and do an evaluation. But please don't build your own.
I'm going to move towards a different kind of question. So in the past, you were a principal at More Consulting. When working in the consulting world, you'll be in contact with clients and resolve towards finding solutions for business problems using code. What would developers expect when working in the consultancy world? And what is the process for handling a client from start to finish? So events like handling requirements before shipping to production, price negotiation, delivery requirement time, and after production services.
Yeah. And so I will say that when I was running More Consulting, that was pretty much a one-person show. I did have some subcontractors I did have some subcontractors occasionally, but I have consulted at companies or been a consultant for companies that had hundreds of employees, so tens of employees. So I'm going to draw from a couple of different sets of experiences to answer the question. But I will say to start out with that I think that every developer would benefit by working in a consulting capacity at some point, especially if they do it themselves. Because when I was a new developer, when I was young, I wrote code. I wrote what I thought was good code. And I looked around to the rest of the business, the people that were out there supporting us, sales folks, accounting folks, executives, and thought, what are those people doing? Like, I'm doing the important thing. I'm writing the code that is what we're selling. Like, everybody else can go, they're just, I don't think I thought this strongly, but I thought, a little bit like, wow, they're kind of wasted space. Like, why on earth would we need them? And then if you go off and do stuff on your own, like I did with more consulting, you realize how much there is to delivering a software product. Yes, there's code that's involved, but as you allude to on the front end, there's finding out what you need to build, finding out who's willing to pay you, making sure they're going to engage with you, which is really kind of the sales process and the requirements gathering process, and then actually building it and then delivering it, which includes documentation and deployment and then ongoing maintenance. And by the way, getting paid at the end of that, right? Or during that process. And those are all critical pieces of building a business, a software business that are above and beyond the actual coding. I have a friend who says that there's really three parts of being a successful consultant. It's finding the work, doing the work, and getting paid for the work. And the middle part is what a lot of people go out and want to do. It's the fun part, but you can't ignore the finding the work and getting paid for the work. If you do, you're going to be dead in the water. So with that context, basically I would find someone who needed me to help them. And that was often through word of mouth. Occasionally I would answer, I think I did some stuff, and this will date me, but like I found some jobs on Craigslist. There are other kind of marketplaces out there that has its own kind of, so what I'm looking for, its own kind of trade-offs. But anyway, you have to find the work, and then you have to like work with the client and assess whether the client's serious, because a lot of people have real big grandiose ideas for being able to build software and no budget. So you're kind of working to find out like, what do they want to build? Do they have the money to pay you? I like to get the conversation kind of like, hey, here's my rate. Get out in front of that, because that'll basically filter out some people. Then you need to define the requirements, and you can do that in a lot of detail if you're doing a fixed bid project, which is where you basically say, hey, you want me to build X, it'll cost you Y dollars, or euros or whatever. And then, or you can do it time and materials, which is where you say, I'm going to charge you $100 an hour or whatever the number is. Then you actually have to start building it. And by the way, when you're building it, a key part of being a consultant is not just doing the work, it's actually communicating with difficulties you've come up with progress you've made. You make sure you communicate to the client, because remember, the client doesn't really have any idea what you're doing. That's why they hired you. They don't know how to evaluate software projects necessarily. And so you want to make sure that you keep them in the loop so that they feel comfortable and they continue to pay you. Then you have the delivery piece where you need to like give them the actual product. And it's a lot easier nowadays with all the hosted services out there, right? The renders and the Netlifys and whatnot. But you need to kind of give that to them and take feedback from them on adjustments they made, because I don't think I've ever been on a single consulting engagement where when you deliver something, they say, you're done, right? Oh, that's perfect. That's exactly what I had in my head. It's always an iterative process to some extent, because people don't realize what they want until they see something in front of them. Yeah, and you can do stuff like mock-ups and whatnot to help them visualize things, but there's no substitute for really having a full live application in front of you to understand what your customers or what your users are going to actually do. And then it's getting paid. And I wrote a story in my blog where I actually pursued a company for payment because for like, I want to say 6 months, and I just pinged them every couple of weeks because they didn't want to pay me. There'd been some turnover inside their organization, and they kind of tightened the belt, and I just kept pinging them and finding different people to ping. And I ended up sending them like a holiday gift. And I think after I sent them a holiday gift, that's what broke their back. And they actually paid me after that, because they're like, this guy's not going away. He sent us like holiday chocolates. Like, we gotta pay him. And then they paid me. And then I stopped bugging him. But yeah, you have to have that. And again, this points to all of the supporting infrastructure that you as a developer in a company get advantage of.
So when, let's say, for example, if I want to create a solution for someone, would you advise, let's say, they hosted on their own server, let's say, for example, their own infrastructure, so they would give me access, let's say, on an AWS console they would own, and I would just deploy it, or would I have to deploy it on my own and charge them per month how much they use?
Yeah, those are two different models. And the nice thing about the second model is that you get recurring revenue, and people are happy to kind of get stuff off their plate. The downside is that now you're an operator as well as a creator, right? You're doing operations of the product as well as developing it. And it really depends on what you as a developer want to do. When I was doing consulting, very often it was, I'll build it and hand it to you to operate. And in the AWS world, it's really nice. Actually, I did this once where I spun up a separate AWS account and I built everything in that account. And then I basically handed the keys to that account over. I disabled my credit card and I handed the keys to the account over to the client when he said, oh yeah, that looks good. And it was a total nice, clean separation. But whether you want to do the build or the build and the operate really depends on how you want to structure your business. It's a lot more effort to do the operate, but again, it leads to recurring revenue, which can help buffer you. Because that's one of the things that consulting, you always have this issue of, you got to sell and you got to always be thinking about your pipeline, weeks or months out, because when the project that you're done with is done, if you don't have another project that is coming down the pike, you're going to have to go out and hustle to try to find something. It's not like an employment where, in theory, you're good to go for years and years, where somebody else is finding the work to give to you.
Before I move to the other question, what about people who actually use like a finished service? They just write on top of it and they just ship it to you as a product. So, for example, let's say a company wants a certain product. Someone would bring, let's say, like a WordPress website. They bring a theme and some plugins. It does the job as they expected it, but it's not the efficient way of doing it, because there might be complexity in those plugins and themes that might make your work much more difficult in the future, but you get up and running easily for the client. What are your thoughts on that? Since a lot of people, they don't like to take the long route, as an example. Mm-hmm. So they don't like to build the product. They say, I want to be in the market very fast. So some company will come up and say, okay, we can do the website and all the features. They would find something that's already built. They do a light modification and they ship it, and they have like a working product in like a month or two, versus building it for like a year or a year and a half, but you have a solid product. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think that whether that makes sense really depends on what the client's needs are. And that is your job as a consultant, to find the client's needs. And some clients are best served by a WordPress website, something that's banged out in a month or two, because what that lets them do is that lets them validate the business idea, or maybe it's just something where they need a presence on the web, or maybe they are experimenting with something, a new line of business or a new way of selling their product. That's totally legitimate. There are other people who need the full control and flexibility of, a custom built solution. But there's a lot of small companies out there or even big companies that are perfectly well served by WordPress, even if it makes developers grimace a little bit. I totally understand that. But one thing that I've learned over my years as a developer is the most beautiful code in the world that is never used is subpar compared to crappy code that actually a business or a person gets value out of. And so I would say that find out what your client wants and also educate your client, right? When you say, hey, we could do this in 2 months with WordPress, and in a year or two, if you've grown a lot, it's going to be painful, or we can do this in a year with custom code or Rails or Django or whatever you're building on top of. But it's going to set you up for success 2-5 years down the road, and educate them and let them make that call. Because some people may choose the quicker route because they may say, well, I'm just experimenting with this, or, you know what, if I take a year to build this, I'm going to get fired, or my project's going to get canceled. And other people may say, yeah, actually, you know what, we've already been through the WordPress phase of our life, and we now know that we need to make that investment because it's going to pay dividends in the long run. But that's absolutely 100% conversation to have with your client. And it may be the client chooses something that you personally don't want to do. And that's a fine time to say, great, you want to do the WordPress route or the quick and dirty route? I'm not your person. You should, and maybe have some people you could refer them to, but it's perfectly legitimate to say, hey, that's not what the business I want to run as a consultant.
That's actually something I do face with sometimes when I do, let's say, like side work, where someone would come up and approach me like, I need something very fast. It's like, I'm not your guy. I'm the kind of guy who just sits down, want to take my time. I want to write things right from the beginning. It takes some time, but it's totally worth it.
Yeah. Or it may not be worth it for them, in which they can find somebody else, right? I'm sure there are other people who are willing to make that trade-off.
Yeah. I'm going to move to another question, which is you wrote a book called Letters to a New Developer, which is published by Apress. What made you consider the idea of writing a book geared toward new developers, and what is the process of writing a book, especially that it's aimed towards beginners?
Yeah. So I wrote a book about it's like a mobile technology called Cordova in early 2010s. And it was a 40, 50 page self-published ebook. And I finished it up. I made a couple $100 from it. And then my company stopped using Cordova, and I realized that I would never update that book. And so I thought, man, I never want to write another technical book in my life. At that point in time, a few years later, I started to get the itch to write a book again, but I thought, I do not want to write a technical book, because if you write a technical book, you have two options. One, you can write a technical book about old technology that isn't changing very much, but there's already a lot of books out there around those. Or you can write one about a new technology, but then as soon as you write it, it's going to be out of date, or you're going to have to spend time every month, every quarter updating it. And I didn't want to get on that treadmill because of my previous experience. So I looked around and I thought, well, what can I do to help people? And I was at the time engineering manager of a small consultancy. And so I was dealing with a lot of junior or new developers. And so they, I saw some of the questions they were asking. I saw some of the difficulties they would have both getting a job and also succeeding at jobs that they had. I was talking to some people at boot camps. I was really kind of in that world. And so I thought, well, this is something that I could help with. And what I started doing was actually writing a blog first. And I think that anybody who's thinking about writing a book, I always say, and I've told plenty of people this, before you think about writing a book, before you even look at publishers or self-publishing, you should write 10 titles for 10 blog posts about the topic of your book. Because if you can't write 10 titles about different aspects of the problem, you're probably not going to be able to write a book. And then, no shocker here, you should write 10 blog posts. And you should do that over time, because again, if you can't commit to 10 blog posts about a topic, you're not going to be able to get through a book. Well, and if you start doing one blog post, two blog posts, and you get bored with the topic, well, you've written a couple blog posts. Nothing's wrong with that. committed to anything. You haven't kind of made the mental and emotional commitment to a book. No harm, no foul. Then after you do those 10 blog posts, and I did more than 10, I did like 100 and some, you can start to think about a book. And the nice thing there is, depending on the book, you actually may have, and would be for non-fiction technical books. A fiction book is a totally different story. Although you could say that Charles Dickens and other people have done serials and built novels out of, essentially blog posts, though they weren't called blog posts back then. But then you have this corpus of material, and that's what I had. So I had 150 or so blog posts before I even wrote my proposal. The proposal was fantastic in terms of forcing me to look at like other people who had written on the same topic, who my target audience was, tighten it down. But I turned those blog posts, I revised them all, and then I added about 10% new blog posts, and that's what turned into the book.
So after you wrote the book, you start getting guest posts on the blog. So you've written the blog posts till you got the book. You got the book deal, you published the book. You kept the blog related to the book, which is a letters to a new developer. Then you started getting guest posts on the blog. Is it like to offset some of the pressure of writing blog posts, or because some people do have experiences you might have not passed with and you decided to share them on for coverage or leverage, for example?
Yeah, so actually I did have guest blog posts before I wrote the book too. And the book actually contains, I had to get legal permission from the guest writers, contains, 10 or so letters from them. So it definitely predated the book. But I think that the answer is both. To answer your question, one, it is nice to not have to write something. And after writing a blog, I was writing weekly for the first year or so, and then I cut back to twice a month, excuse me. It is nice to have something else that someone else provides. Absolutely. But it is the other kind of two main reasons why I like have guest posters are, one, it lets people stand on my platform, and my platform is not huge, right? But it goes out to a couple hundred people, and I've definitely had other people discover my blog. And so I can offer something to somebody else and say, hey, you know what? I have a small audience. I have an audience. It might be bigger than your audience, but it's definitely different than your audience. And you can get access to that by writing something. And the second benefit, which you allude to, is, or what you said, is that people have different experiences. So if you were to write a letter to a new developer, your experience would be absolutely different than mine, based on kind of where you live and who you are and how your development experience has been. And I've had people who, I think of one, this person worked at a huge company, and he wrote a blog post about how to interact with people at job fairs, which I think is super helpful to new developers who are going to job fairs, COVID notwithstanding, of course. But I never would have written that because I've never run a booth at a job fair, and I never will, probably because I tend to work at smaller companies. There are other people who write from the perspective of, women or minorities or people that are trying to interview at FANG companies, and so to be able to bring that additional perspective in, I think is very valuable to my community.
So you've worked with different companies ranging from startups and enterprises. What's the difference between working with a startup versus working with an enterprise? As someone who's starting out, would you recommend working in an enterprise company first to establish decent skills, or to leverage a startup from the beginning?
Great question. So the first part of it is the difference between them, and the second is what I would recommend to a new developer. So as far as kind of the first part goes, I would say that enterprises have a lot more money, they have a lot more leverage, and the class of problems they work on are going to be kind of unique and bigger, like in terms of scale. They have, because of that size, they are slower to move. There's more bureaucracy. There's more places to hide. I remember at my first job, we were a company we started kind of small and we grew. And one of my colleagues said, wow, we finally got big enough where somebody can hide. And if you've ever worked in enterprise, there are people who are just kind of like keeping their seat warm. And not everybody, absolutely not everybody in enterprise, but there definitely is space for that. At a startup, in contrast, you're not going to have scale problems necessarily, or scale, like really big, interesting, huge problems. You're going to have small problems, and they're going to be close to the customer. And you're going to move fast, and it's going to be chaotic. There's not going to be structure. There's not going to be, a mentorship plan necessarily. And at the same time, you'll have a tremendous opportunity to learn and to grow because, again, you're just trying to figure stuff out. And there are stages of startups, right? There's the startups that are 2 or 5 people, and then there's startups that are 100 people. And they'll have different levels of chaos and different levels of organization. But in general, both kinds of startups will have less than an enterprise company. To answer the second part of your question, I would challenge your listeners to go back and listen to my descriptions of enterprises versus startups, and which one is more exciting to you, right? Do you want to fit in and be, one part of a hopefully well-oiled machine in an enterprise, or do you want to take part in, building something from the ground up and the learning opportunities that come with that? And which one of those? They're both good paths. Fundamentally, I think that it's probably easier for a new developer to slot into a bigger company because they can get more mentorship. Things can be more structured. So I guess if I didn't know anything about the person asking the question, I'd probably recommend going to a bigger company. But I would actually recommend going to a bigger consulting company, because I think that all the skills you learn in a consulting company and the different domains you get experience in, and the fact that it's easier to get hired at a consulting company than it is to get hired at a big product company, that's what I would lean toward. But that is, frankly, that advice is reflective of my experience, and someone else would give different advice, I would think.
I actually would give a different opinion about this. I started working with startups way before moving towards enterprise. I've worked with startups because you get this, how I'm going to say this, the glamorous life of showing off. When you're in an enterprise, you become this small fish in a big pond, versus when you're in a startup, you're the big fish in a small pond. So you're more visible at a certain level, whereas when you're in an enterprise, you're not that visible. Maybe someone else is much more experienced than you, can take the show. You're not going to be showing up. But the good part about enterprises is that you get the salary per month, you get the bonuses, you get stuff for doing work there, compared to a startup where you have to grind with your teeth actually to either get a steady paycheck or when you get a run of investment.
Yep.
But I have the fortune, I'm going to say this, the fortunate opportunity to work with startups at an early age when I was 17. So I've been into the VC pitch. I've seen investors going around, all of that at an early age. I had an idea. Shifting towards, let's say, enterprise, the current company that I'm working in is almost, you could say, an enterprise level. But I once got a guest on the podcast and I told him I won't shift to enterprise until like I'm 30, so that when I have like a family and I don't care about doing anything anymore, I would just work in an enterprise, support the family. I might do something for fun on the side, but like I would get like the basics done, just raise a good family, have a steady paycheck that pays bills, and then do something on the side, maybe for funds. That's my idea of how I see it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes total sense. The flip side is, if you go work in enterprise right out of school, you're going to get, how do I put this politely? You're probably, over the space of enterprises and the space of startups, you're probably going to get a better education in software processes at an enterprise than you would at a startup, right? Like, there are startups out there that plenty of them are doing great work, really tight processes and really good software engineering, but plenty of startups or chaotic messes where people are just trying to figure stuff out too. And especially if you're a new developer being led by other new developers, people might not know what they don't know. So, again, I think it really comes down to personal preference.
I'm going to shift towards a different question, which is you worked as a director of engineering at Culture Foundry. What's the role of a director of engineering, and what does it differ between other roles, let's say like developer relations or developer advocate?
Sure, good question. So, director of engineering, this was at a kind of a smaller consulting company, and so it was really a player coach role, if you're familiar with that term, which basically means I wasn't just managing people, but I was also like writing code too. Sometimes a director of engineering or an engineering manager will actually just have the responsibilities of managing people and like helping coordinate projects and things like that without writing any code. But, I think that engineering management is, I like to say that engineering management is as close to engineering as American football is to normal football. In both, there's similarities. In both games, you score points. In both games, there's a winner, there's two teams, but there's a lot of differences. And so in the case of Culture Foundry, I actually wasn't hired as a director of engineering. I was hired as a senior software engineer, but the opportunity came up to try to take on this role. And with engineering management, especially in a smaller company, I was again wearing a lot of hats. So I was writing some code, I was doing requirements gathering, I was helping mentor new developers and hire new developers for our company. I was in sales meetings. I was working on infrastructure pieces. So that was one of the joys of it. It was kind of problematic in that I felt like I was stretched in a lot of different ways. But the primary goal was to make sure the engineering team was running well. And again, that's making sure that we are having the right people and we're heading in the right direction, and we're communicating that we're heading in the right direction to all of our clients and to the other stakeholders in the company.
It's quite interesting. Going to shift also to a different question, which is about side projects. You have a side project called farmshares.info, which been maintained for 9 years. That's a long side project, if I want to say, from February 2010 till January 2019. A good portion of side projects die or get archived by the developer because sometimes they don't have time, or they say like, I have important things. But you maintained that side project for 9 years. 9 years, man. That's a lot. Do you want to talk more about this? Would you, let's say, for example, how did you maintain it for 9 years? How did you have the mental capacity for maintaining something for that long?
Sure. So thank you, and rest in peace, farmshares.info. I let it go a couple of years ago, as was mentioned. So I think that the most important, well, there are two parts that I think played a role in its longevity. The first is that I was really passionate about it, and farmshares.info was basically a directory of farms that sold shares. I don't know how prevalent this is across the world, but in the US, you can basically pay a farm in the spring, and you say, I'm going to pay you a couple $100, and then as the farm raises, vegetables and whatnot, you get a share of those for the summer and into the fall. And it's a great way to support the farm, and it gets you fresh vegetables and it gets you out in the community. And so I actually was really passionate about that aspect of local food. And so that's one reason that it lasted for a long time, is that I kept being like, this is an important part of my life. It's an important part of my identity. I'm going to spend time and effort on it. The second thing is that I wrote the bulk of the code for that project in, 2010, 2009, actually, that time period. And then it was mostly a maintenance phase, right? So it was updating the information. It was occasionally adding new features. It was, a lot less effort towards the end. But, the benefit of a side project, and this one actually definitely helped me in some ways, is it lets you experiment with different technologies in a real world way with real people in low pressure way. So I installed JavaScript tools that I was curious about that I'm not sure I actually I'm not sure I actually ever end up using them in production code that I was paid for, but definitely let me kick the tires on some things and like experiment with some things. So maybe that's three things, right? Like find something you're passionate in, find a way to, realize that most side projects actually have an initial burst and then go into maintenance mode. And the third thing is find ways to use that as a test bed to experiment. And I think that'll keep you engaged in a side project.
But some people develop side projects in the expectation of making money. Nowadays, they just do side projects like a library or a framework, and they like GitHub sponsor it, or they put like a Patreon or a donation section. But in the past, at the time you actually developed it, there's no sponsorships, there is no Patreon, there's no direct way of giving you money except for, let's say, telling someone, hey, if you want to send me money, contact me on the side, or you might take parts of the revenue that comes from the shares of this product, which was capable of sustaining itself to keep it alive. But now you have much more options compared to in the past. Mm-hmm. But people lean towards things that would bring them like easy money, like a library that solves something, than doing a full-on solution.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to that. I do know that we sold a couple ads, never enough to like make, I think it might have covered hosting costs or something like that. I think people, I guess I'd push back on you a little bit. I think that there are plenty of people out there who still write blogs or do things that are for just sharing the love of sharing knowledge. There are definitely products out there that make it a lot easier to monetize your side project, right? And that could be, like you said, GitHub sponsors or Patreon, but it also could be something like Gumroad or LeanPub that lets you sell an info product. People need to do what works for them. I think that there is absolute benefit in doing something for dollars, for money. I mean, who doesn't want more money? But there's also benefit in doing something to scratch an itch yourself, and just it also makes it a lot easier to say, actually, I'm not going to do anything on this side project this month because it's not making me any money. And honestly, the hosting costs, again, with free hosting platforms or small, easy hosting platforms, make it so easy to, it's not that much money to just keep something running if you're not investing your time in it.
Yeah. I'm going to shift to another question, which is, you were the CTO and co-founder of the Food Corridor. In your perspective, what is the role of a CTO, and what are the challenges you faced while being a CTO?
Yeah. So one thing that's worth noting is that a CTO is not a CTO is not a CTO, the same way as a solution architect is not a solution architect. Yeah, a CTO of a small startup, as the Food Corridor was, plays an entirely different role than a CTO of a 100-person or a 5,000-person company. So just to preface that I was a CTO of a 2-person startup. When I left, I think we were 4 or 5 people. They're still going strong. It's amazing. I'm really, thefoodcorridor.com if you want to check out a kitchen or if you run a shared kitchen in US or Canada, you can check it out. But I think the role of CTO at a small startup is really to build the product. And that means not just writing the code, but making sure that you're building the right product, talking to customers all the time, doing customer support, building the operations structures so that you can start to scale up the company. And that's what I did. So I sat on a lot of customer calls. I wrote a lot of code. I answered customer issues. I fixed bugs that I had written, and I did it all in a way that in a framework that I thought was the best option for the problem we were solving, and as fast as I could.
So before actually being the CTO, you actually worked as an AWS instructor at QuickCloud. So what are the requirements of being an AWS instructor? And it's a requirement to have certain amount of certificates or all certificates take on this role. I did, just to put into context, I did actually 2 episodes with 2 AWS employees, and we've discussed about this topic, I think in length, but we've discussed about it from someone who comes from AWS. specifically to teach people. But I have never take the perspective of someone who worked at, let's say, an institution to
Sure.
give.
Sure. Yeah. So, I don't know what the requirements are now. I can only tell you what they were in 2016, 2017 when I did that for QuickCloud. So I had experience working with AWS, and I had to get a certificate, and then I was cleared to teach that class. I went through a little bit of training where I observed some other trainers, and then I was kind of thrown in the deep end. And you couldn't teach a class for which you didn't own that, you didn't hold that certificate. But other than that, that was pretty much the requirements. I do think they've made that a little more stringent now, in terms of what they require your instructors to be able to do. But at that point, that was all that I had to do. I had to have some real world experience, and I had to pass the test.
Yeah, now you actually have to be a accredited instructor. It's a long process. It's a huge process to get it.
I mean, on the bigger question of like certifications, I think that they're absolutely worthwhile, and I still maintain one of my AWS certifications because I think that it's a worthwhile thing to have.
I have like 5.
Nice.
I'm scoring my 6 actually in the end of September.
Oh wow! Good luck. That's
Have you ever watched Avengers? Thanos, you get the crystals.
I've seen the memes. Is that what you're looking to do?
Yeah,
are you trying to get all?
the
Are there 9 or 10 of them? How many are there now?
I think some of them are retired, but some people do have the retired certificates before. So let's say like the Alexa one, if you have it, there's no way to get it, but if you have it, it's with you. So there are some rare certificates.
Sure.
I think there are 12, if I'm not mistaken. There's the cloud practitioners. There's 3 associate. Those are 4. There's the 2 professionals. Those are around 5. And you have like around 5 or 6 on the specialty part. So they're hovering between 10 to 12, if you want to say.
Cool. Well, good luck in September.
Yep. Thank you. You've worked with several companies in the past, from consultancy, real estate, in your 20 years of experience as a software developer, from different various, I'm going to say this, from different points of view. So you've worked in consultancy, you've worked with people who worked in real estate, you've worked with people who develop code for a solution. In this 20 years experience, what is the feeling of shifting between one industry to another? Even though code-wise, you might be writing something similar in this company than in that company. So sometimes code paradigms don't change, but I'm going to say this, the environment change itself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that it's actually beneficial to you to move between different business domains, because you realize that code is like accounting, right? It's something that every business needs. And I think that when you move to a different domain, you realize how much knowledge people have that aren't developers. And so you end up becoming more, I end up becoming more humble when I go into, authorization or real estate, or I did some work around GIS stuff. And you realize just how much knowledge there is embedded in people's heads. I think it's a good thing to do. And actually, that's one of the reasons I think that working for a consultancy is a really good idea, because it trains you to like dive in, try to figure out a domain where there's jargon and people have these concepts that they know and they understand, that they've spent their, 5 years with, or their careers with, that you don't really understand, but yet you need to be able to speak that language to be able to write software in a way that is going to be maintainable and correct. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure I did, but
it answers the question, because it's not about working with a different environment. It's just healthy to get a different point of view. But sometimes writing code can be the same in different companies, because some things just don't change.
Yeah, I mean, I should be careful here. Pretty much every company is going to have some kind of database, right? Like they're going to store data somewhere. These days, most companies are going to have some kind of web application, although some people are mobile first if you're a startup. But yeah, there are definitely things you can bring across different companies, especially around software processes and like excellence in software engineering. But you have to combine that with learning about the domain because, again, the perfectly written code that doesn't actually solve the business problem is not going to get used.
Yeah, I always end actually my podcast with a mental health question. I have this like ritual where I always end with a mental health question at the end. Have you ever faced burnout or imposter syndrome? If you did, what did you do to resolve towards this issue? The reason why I raised the whole burnout and imposter syndrome because it's the most common thing that we see in our industry. Each person has a different point of view. Would you like to pitch in on that?
Sure, of course. So I've been lucky enough that I've never experienced burnout. And that's been, I'm basically reading people's stories. I'm very thankful of that. But I absolutely 100% have suffered imposter syndrome. And this was pretty common when I was consulting. There was always maybe 2 weeks into any project that I ever did where I was overwhelmed by the information, by learning about the new team members, by learning about the project, by feeling that I wasn't moving fast enough. And I'd always think, oh my gosh, I'm not the right person for this. How can I possibly like solve this problem? It almost always happened where I just felt like I wasn't the right person. And the way I kind of dealt with it is pushing through. And, again, I have privilege for your listeners who can't see me. I'm a white dude in the USA. So obviously born into, a lot of privilege, but even I still feel like, hey, I'm not the right person for this. And I guess the way I resolved it is I was lucky enough to go through that multiple times at a consultancy or in a consulting area. And after something happens to you the third or fourth time, you realize that it's a pattern, and that actually I was able to complete those projects. I was able to solve those problems. And so you start to hear it as what it is, which is, just self-doubt. And that's a healthy thing to have, right? Speaking of Thanos, I wouldn't want to have a business partner or a colleague who had zero self-doubt. I think that's a bad place to be. You should have some self-introspection, but what you need to realize is that you're in that place to do because people believe that you can do it. And once you get through it a couple of times, once you get to that imposter syndrome a couple of times and you put in the work, then hopefully you can look back at your past experiences and say, oh yeah, I felt that way 2 months ago, 2 years ago, and guess what? I did do that. And you can look at your LinkedIn or your GitHub or your journal to like prove to yourself that you actually succeeded. And hopefully that will help alleviate imposter syndrome. Although, to be honest, again, I started a new job 2 years ago at FusionAuth, and I still had imposter syndrome for a while when I was there, just because I think it's impossible not to feel overwhelmed when you start a new position.